The clink of silverware fades as I spot the guest at the far end of the table. Still, my breath catches when his sleeve rolls up. There it is, the secret birthmark, a symbol of our bloodline. As my son's face drains of color, I know he's seen it too. While the room hums with conversation, the weight of that mark settles over me. The same mark I thought had been lost forever. That's when my son looks at me, his voice trembling. "Who is he, Mom?" I turn to face him, the truth already slipping from my lips. "Your brother." "All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." The clink of silverware on porcelain echoed through the Ellery dining room as the long table, bathed in the amber glow of crystal chandeliers, hummed with quiet chatter. The scent of rich, slow-roasted lamb and freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the earthy aroma of southern magnolia drifting in through the open windows. The local press had been invited, though their presence was as much for show as for any true interest in the family. After all, the Ellerys were a spectacle, and spectacle required an audience. Margot stood in the doorway, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor as she entered. Her gaze swept over the polished faces around the table, each of them as carefully placed as the porcelain serving dishes. But her attention was drawn to the end of the table where a young man sat. At first, she thought nothing of him. His face was unfamiliar, but that was hardly a rarity in a family as sprawling as theirs. He was leaning slightly forward, his broad shoulders set against the rich, dark oak of the chair, politely joining in a conversation with Nina, who sat opposite him. He was well dressed in a black blazer, crisp shirt, though his hands, those hands, were strangely unpolished, as though the man had only just entered this world of southern grandeur. As Margot walked toward her place at the head of the table, she saw the man's wrist move slightly as he reached for a piece of bread. And there it was, a birthmark, a crescent-shaped mark, small but unmistakable, faint but clear against the pale skin of his wrist. The same shape, the same placement. Margot's breath caught in her chest. Her heart beat louder than the sounds around her as her eyes locked onto that mark. It wasn't just any birthmark. It was the birthmark, identical to the one her late husband Caleb had carried, and to the one Dane had. A mark passed through generations, a mark that wasn't shared by anyone else, no one but family. Margot's mind flashed back in a whirl of memories, of nights spent in the soft, quiet dark with Caleb, his laughter, their life together, their children. She had seen that birthmark countless times, on Caleb's wrist when they danced in the garden, on Dane's when he was a boy, pulling at her to listen to some ridiculous story. But she had not seen it on this man, this stranger, sitting in her home. The blood drained from her face, the warmth of the room, the laughter, the conversations. It all seemed to fade, leaving only the pulse in her ears and the strange unspoken certainty that swept through her like a cold wind. For a long moment she couldn't move. Her feet were rooted to the floor, her fingers tightening around the back of her chair, and yet she couldn't look away from the mark. It was like a door had opened, a door she hadn't known existed. Margot blinked, a slow and deliberate motion, trying to force herself back into the present. But the room felt distant, as if the floor had tilted underfoot. And then, the man looked up. His eyes met hers. The calmness in his gaze, his kindness, the quiet understanding that seemed to hold all the mysteries of the world, made the air feel too thin. He smiled. "Ben," he said, as if introducing himself to someone who had never met him before. "Dane invited me." His voice was warm, but there was an edge of hesitation, as though he could sense the weight of Margot's gaze. But it was the birthmark, their birthmark, that held her captive. Margot did not speak immediately. The silence between them stretched, as thick and uncomfortable as the heavy velvet curtains that framed the windows. Her mind whirled. Dane. Dane knew him. Her son. But why hadn't he told her? Why hadn't he mentioned this person at all? She felt a sharp twist in her chest, a pull that threatened to unravel the careful balance she had maintained all these years. Her family's secrets, their reputation, had they all been built on the shifting sands of half-truths? Dane was standing behind her now, his voice low as he asked, "Is everything all right, Mother?" Margot turned slowly, her eyes finding his. There it was, the faintest trace of fear in his face. A tremor she had never seen before, not from him. He was pale, too pale. Like the blood had drained from his face the moment their gazes met. For a long moment, he held her stare. His lips pressed tight together as if he was fighting to keep the truth locked away. Margot swallowed, her throat dry. "Who is he, Dane?" she asked, the question falling from her lips with a quiet intensity that made the room feel colder. Dane's eyes flickered to Ben, then back to her, his mouth opening and closing as though he was trying to find the words. But none came, and that was when she knew. Something was terribly wrong. Something had been hidden for far too long. Ben, still seated at the far end of the table, glanced nervously from Dane to Margot, his smile faltering. He shifted slightly in his chair, his hands still resting on the breadbasket in front of him. Margot's eyes never left him. The question she had asked was still hanging in the air, unresolved, unanswered. Ben shifted again, his fingers brushing the edge of the bread. And then, he did the unthinkable. He turned his wrist just slightly, as if it were the most natural movement in the world. Margot saw the crescent-shaped mark once more. Her breath caught in her throat, and the world around her tilted. The realization hit with the force of a crashing wave. The room was still. And in that moment, everything changed. The grand dining room was now a distant hum in Margot's ears. She felt as though the air itself had turned colder, heavier, wrapping around her chest in an oppressive knot. Her fingers still gripped the edge of her chair, the polished wood beneath her nails grounding her as her eyes refused to leave Ben. His smile was gone, replaced with a quiet uncertainty, and that mark on his wrist, the mark she knew too well, was branded into her mind. Dane hadn't spoken since her question. He had only stared, his face pale, lips pressed tight. The space between them had become a chasm. She didn't need him to answer anymore. The silence was the answer. As the clink of silverware returned faintly from the far end of the table, Margot stood up, her legs feeling unsteady as if they weren't quite her own. She had to leave the room. The truth, whatever it was not something she could process surrounded by the soft murmur of dinner guests and the weight of her family's reputation pressing down on her. She turned and walked swiftly toward the hallway, the clicking of her heels against the polished floors echoing too loudly. The world outside that dining room, where the Ellery legacy was still holding court, was starting to feel like a lie. Margot pushed open the door to the library, her sanctuary. The walls lined with bookshelves, the heavy curtains drawn against the late afternoon sun. This was where she could think. She stepped inside, breathing deeply, feeling the familiar scent of aged leather and old paper fill her lungs. Then she heard it. A soft knock at the doorframe. Ben stood there, his tall figure half-shadowed in the dim light of the hall. His expression was tentative, like a boy unsure of his welcome. "Do you think we've met before?" he asked, his voice low but urgent, like a question that had been forming for too long. Margot's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she couldn't speak. She had known, of course, that something had been off about him from the very beginning. There was a familiarity in the curve of his cheekbones, in the way he held himself, a quiet, unspoken recognition. But that mark, that damned mark, it was the only thing that truly mattered now. She blinked, her mind racing. The memory was sharp, slicing through her carefully constructed defenses. 23 years ago, Caleb had disappeared. It had only been for a week, but it had torn her world apart. Dane had insisted it was nothing, that it wasn't what it looked like. But there had been something in his eyes, in the way he avoided her questions, in the way his smile never reached his eyes when he came home. Margot had tried to press him, to understand, but he had deflected, and her intuition told her more than her husband ever had. And now this, Ben, the son she didn't know existed, the child born in the silence of that week. Margot's hand trembled as she slowly closed the distance between herself and Ben. There was no need for more words, no need for further explanations. She reached for his hand without thinking. The warmth of his skin against hers was grounding, familiar in a way she couldn't explain. Her thumb brushed across his wrist, searching, almost as if she needed to confirm what she already knew. She turned his hand toward the light. The mark was unmistakable. The crescent shape, like a faint scar, just below his wrist bone. A trace of a family line that had been hidden away in shadows for years, a part of the Ellery bloodline no one had spoken of. Her breath caught in her chest, and she pulled her hand away, her own pulse rushing in her ears. "My God," she whispered, her voice breaking the silence between them. Ben's eyes flickered to the mark, then back to her. There was no surprise in his expression, no shock, as though he had always known. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I knew," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I always knew. I wasn't just from nowhere." Margot's chest tightened. The words had landed like stones in her stomach, heavy and impossible to swallow. He had known, and yet she hadn't. Her son, Dane, her family, had kept this secret for so long, for so many years. But why? What had they done to protect themselves, to protect the family's reputation, at the cost of this boy's existence? Ben took a step forward, as if drawn to her, his voice softer now, more vulnerable. "I wasn't supposed to find out, was I?" Margot swallowed, her throat dry. She tried to steady herself, but the weight of it all, this revelation, this family secret, was more than she could bear. Her fingers pressed against her temple as if to block out the flood of thoughts, the rush of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "You have every right to know the truth," she said, her voice cracking, but with a finality that surprised even her. Ben stared at her, the quiet understanding still in his eyes. But it wasn't just understanding anymore. There was something else there now, something almost like pity, like he had already accepted the world that had been built for him, a world that didn't want him. But it was the truth, and truth was an unstoppable force. Margot felt the room close in around her, and suddenly she needed air. She needed to think. She needed to be alone with this new knowledge before the world, before her family, came crashing down on her once again. As she stepped past him, she hesitated. "I'll be in touch," she said, though the words felt foreign coming from her mouth. She wasn't sure what they meant anymore, what it all meant. Ben nodded, but as he stood there, his hand slipping into his pocket, he didn't seem surprised. He knew this was only the beginning. And so did Margot. The truth had already found its way into the light. And now, nothing would ever be the same. The weight of Margot's thoughts lingered as she left the library, each step heavier than the last. Ben's face was etched into her mind, the mark on his wrist a constant reminder of a truth she hadn't been prepared to face. The halls of the mansion, once filled with laughter and conversation, now felt oppressive, as if they were closing in around her. She needed answers, but the ones she had already uncovered were suffocating. Margot's eyes scanned the foyer, but there was no one. The house seemed still, far too still. Then she saw him. Caleb Rourke, her late husband's old friend, stood near the front door, his gray hair falling like a halo around his furrowed brow. He had always been a presence in the background of her life, his unspoken knowledge of her family's secrets weighing heavily in the shadows. Caleb had been more than a friend. He had been an ally when Margot needed one most. But now, she wasn't sure what to make of him. How much did he know? How much had he kept hidden? Caleb, Margot said, her voice a little too sharp, a little too tight. I need to talk to you. He looked up slowly, his eyes sad, resigned. He had aged in ways she hadn't fully noticed before. His face now a map of time's toll. But there was something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. This wasn't just about her husband anymore. This was about a secret too long buried. He nodded, stepping forward as she motioned toward the study. They moved in silence, the air thick with the things they had both left unsaid over the years. When they were seated, Margot didn't waste time. Her voice, low but steady, broke the silence. Ben, you know who he is, don't you? Caleb's eyes flickered, but his face remained unreadable. The world seemed to contract as he took a breath and, in that moment, the silence between them stretched long, holding the weight of decades. He finally spoke. Yes, Margot, I know who he is. He's your grandson. The words hit her like a physical blow. Her heart seemed to skip a beat, the air thickening around her, as if the very fabric of time had split wide open. She leaned forward, hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the desk. My grandson? She repeated, the disbelief in her voice cutting through the quiet. You're telling me, Caleb, you knew about this and never said a word? My husband, Caleb, my husband, fathered a child? Caleb lowered his gaze, his hands clasped in front of him, the weight of his own guilt heavy in the room. He didn't meet her eyes, but when he spoke, his voice was thick with regret. Margot, it wasn't that simple. Your husband disappeared. That week. It was strange. We thought we were protecting the boy, keeping him safe. Caleb thought it would be better if no one knew. For the child's sake, for the family's sake. He hesitated, then added, almost too quietly. He thought the boy would be safer unknown. Margot's breath caught in her throat. The pieces of the puzzle that had been jumbled for so many years were beginning to click into place, but the clarity only deepened her pain. Caleb, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. How could he just leave me in the dark? How could he do that to me, to all of us? Caleb's gaze softened, but there was nothing he could say to ease her hurt. He didn't want to hurt you. He didn't know what else to do. The boy's mother. She was already gone. She passed away last year. That's when Ben found the letter. The letter? Margot's mind spun. She had heard nothing of a letter. What letter? She couldn't understand how everything had been kept from her, from the rest of the family. How had Ben even known? Caleb took a slow breath, his voice growing quieter, more tentative. It was the letter that had the truth. It was written by Caleb himself. He made me promise that I'd keep it quiet, keep the boy away. And for years, I did. But after the mother passed, Ben came to Savannah. He found it. Margot's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had always known Caleb had a tendency to hide things from her. But this was something else. How could she have been so blind? How had she allowed herself to believe the comfortable lies her family had lived on for so long? Her husband, her son, her family had been hiding a child, a part of their blood, and no one had seen fit to tell her. She stood abruptly, pacing the room in agitation. And Dane? She demanded. Did he know? Was he a part of this? Caleb remained silent for a moment, his hands still folded in front of him, his lips drawn tight. Then, with a small sigh, he nodded. Yes, Dane knew. He was the one who asked me to keep Ben out of Savannah. He paid me to ensure the boy never came back here. Margot froze. The room spun, her vision blurring. Her son, had paid to keep his own brother away. The weight of that betrayal, the depth of it, crashed down on her like a tidal wave. Dane had known all along, and yet he had never once breathed a word. He had kept this secret from her, from their family. Margot staggered back, her hands pressed to her temples. She felt sick, dizzy, as if the foundation beneath her had cracked wide open. Her entire life, her marriage, her son, her family, had been built on lies. Why? She choked out. Why would he do that? Why didn't he tell me? Caleb's expression softened, but his words were no less painful. He didn't want to risk losing everything, Margot. The Ellery legacy, the reputation. He thought if people knew, it would ruin everything. Margot took a sharp breath, her mind whirling with this new reality. How long had this been going on? She turned toward Caleb, her voice shaking, but stronger now. I need to see Dane. But as Caleb reached for her arm to stop her, she knew. Nothing was ever going to be the same again. Margot's hand shook as she dialed the number for the family lawyer, the sound of the ring echoing in her ear like the ticking of a clock she couldn't stop. The weight of everything, Ben, the truth, the family's legacy, settled heavily on her shoulders. She could no longer keep the truth buried. It was time to make it official, to confirm what she already knew, to ensure that no one could deny it again. The lawyer's voice was crisp and professional when he answered, but Margot couldn't shake the chill in her chest. She wasn't just calling to discuss some minor legal matter. This was about something far bigger. Something that had been hidden in the shadows for far too long. I need Ben to meet me at your office, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil swirling inside. We're starting the process, the paternity test, quietly. The lawyer hesitated for only a moment before agreeing, his tone uncharacteristically soft. Understood. I'll prepare everything. She ended the call and sat back in the worn leather chair in the study. The weight of the decision felt like a stone sinking in her gut. There was no going back now. The past would have to face the light. The next day, Ben arrived at the lawyer's office, his presence understated but solid. His quiet demeanor contrasted with the storm that had been unleashed in the Ellery family, but there was something about him, something that was both familiar and foreign, that made Margot's heart ache. He sat across from her at the polished wooden table, his gaze unwavering as he waited for her to speak. There was no rush, no expectation. Just a quiet understanding that the world had shifted, and now they both had to adjust. Margot's voice was calm but firm. We're going to do this the right way. Legally. No more uncertainty. Ben nodded, his eyes flickering with a trace of unease. I understand. I never thought it would come to this. The lawyer entered, carrying a stack of documents that would change everything. They were words on paper, but to Margot, they felt like the first steps toward reclaiming what had been taken from Ben. A future he deserved, a place at the table that had been denied him for so long. As they began the paperwork, Margot's thoughts drifted. She couldn't help but notice the subtle way Nina had started to spend more time with Ben. It wasn't just about the family dinners anymore. It was deeper than that. She had seen Nina pulling Ben aside at gatherings, their conversations soft but intense, like two people who had finally found the connection that had been missing. Margot had overheard Nina's voice in the hallway, a quiet whisper to Ben. You know, you're more Ellery than Dad ever was. You're not just some outsider. Margot's heart twisted. She had been watching, but Nina hadn't been hiding it. She was letting herself be drawn to Ben, to the truth. And as much as Margot could feel the pull of her own emotions, she couldn't ignore the undeniable shift in the family dynamic. This wasn't just about bloodlines anymore. It was about who deserved what. It was about what had been kept from them all these years. But Dane had noticed too. His voice had been low and tight when he spoke to Lisa the night before. "This has gone far enough. We need to shut it down, Lisa. I don't care how, but it needs to end." Lisa's response had been quick, sharp. "You think I don't know that? This is gossip, Dane. Dangerous gossip. It's threatening everything we've worked for." Margot had been standing in the doorway when the conversation ended, her back stiff with the weight of the words that had been said in anger and fear. The Ellery name, the legacy they had so carefully cultivated, it was all crumbling now, and Dane was terrified of losing it all. But Lisa was terrified of losing him. Margot hadn't moved. She hadn't said a word, but in that moment she had realized how deep the divide really was. It wasn't just about Ben anymore. It wasn't just about the past. It was about power, control, and the stories they told themselves to keep everything intact. Back at the lawyer's office, Margot signed the final document, her pen scratching across the paper with the finality of a judgment. She felt the weight lift from her shoulders, but it was replaced by something else, a sense of inevitability. There was no going back from this. Ben stood, his face unreadable. "What happens now?" "We wait for the results," Margot said, standing up and collecting the papers. She glanced at him, her eyes steady, but something in the way she looked at him shifted. "But once we have confirmation, there's no denying it. You are family now." The words tasted bitter on her tongue, but they were the truth. And the truth was never kind. Ben nodded quietly, his expression shifting to something more uncertain. "What happens to them?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Dane, Lisa, the rest of them?" Margot looked out the window, the sun beginning to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the floor. "That," she said softly, "is something we'll have to face together." But as she said it, she knew it wouldn't be together. Not really, because as much as she wanted to believe in unity, the rift between her and her son, between her and the family, was growing. And no matter how she tried to bridge the gap, the truth, their truth, was already too far gone. When the test results came in, it would be final. And Margot had no idea how the family would survive that truth. The envelope sat on the desk, heavy and final. Margot stared at it, the white paper stark against the worn wood. She had opened it already, the results now etched into her mind with a clarity that made her pulse race. 99%. Ben was Dane's brother, he was her grandson. The bloodline, long kept secret, was undeniable. She hadn't expected it to feel this way, this cold, this definite. But as the paper crinkled under her fingers, the truth sank in with a force she couldn't shake. She had always known something was off about her family, the secrets they kept. But this was the thing they could never outrun. The truth. It was now inescapable. Sighing deeply, she slipped the report into her safe. It seemed so final, so absolute. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Margot reached for her phone and dialed the number of the family estate lawyer. He picked up on the second ring, his voice low and measured. "I need you to file this with the court," she said, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of exhaustion. "It's time." A pause on the other end. "Margot, are you sure? This will change everything." She closed her eyes, letting the weight of the decision settle. "I've kept their secrets long enough," she murmured. "This is for Ben." After hanging up, she sat back, her mind turning over the consequences. It would send ripples through the family, Dane, Lisa, all of them. They would fight it. But nothing could change the truth, and she was done pretending it didn't exist. It was time to move forward, to give Ben the place he deserved in the family. Later that afternoon, Margot arranged a lunch with Ben. It was just the two of them, in a quiet corner of the dining room, away from the bustle of the house. The table was set simply, but the air between them was thick with unspoken words. Ben was already seated when Margot entered, his shoulders hunched slightly, his hands folded in his lap. The silence between them seemed to pulse. Margot sat down across from him, feeling the full weight of her actions. She had kept this from him for so long, but now she had to explain it all. For him. She cleared her throat, trying to steady the flutter in her chest. "Ben," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "The DNA results came in this morning. There's no mistaking it." She took a deep breath, eyes meeting his. "You're Dane's brother. You're my grandson." Ben's expression didn't change at first. He just stared at her, his brow furrowed, as if trying to make sense of the words she'd said. Then, slowly, a tremor seemed to pass through him. His hands shook slightly, and his voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. "I always knew," he said, his voice cracking. "I always knew I didn't just come from nowhere." Margot's throat tightened. She had prepared for this moment, but hearing the words, seeing the raw emotion in Ben's eyes, brought it all rushing to the surface. She hadn't realized how much it would hurt, how much the truth would sting, even when she knew it was the right thing to do. Ben blinked, a single tear slipping down his cheek before he wiped it away quickly, trying to regain control. His voice trembled as he spoke again, his gaze never leaving hers. "It just never felt right. I didn't belong with them. I felt it my whole life. But I never had anyone to turn to. No one to explain it." Margot reached across the table, her hand settling gently over his. The warmth of her touch seemed to offer him some measure of comfort, but it didn't stop the ache in her chest. This wasn't just about Ben. It was about the years of silence, the years of hiding away a part of the family. It was about Dane, about the choices he had made, and the lies he had told. She let her hand rest there for a moment longer before pulling back, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm sorry, Ben," she said softly. "I never knew. I never knew you existed, and when I did, I couldn't protect you the way I should have. But now that I know, I will. You are part of this family, and you will always have a place here." Ben's shoulders seemed to relax, just a little, though the sadness in his eyes never fully left. I always wondered," he whispered, "why no one ever told me. Why I had to find out this way." Margot swallowed hard, her mind flashing to the years she had spent in silence, trying to keep everything intact. The Ellery name, the legacy, the reputation, it had always been more important than truth. But Ben? Ben wasn't just some secret to be hidden. He was family. "I don't know," she said, her voice small. "But you're here now, and that's what matters." Ben nodded, his gaze drifting toward the window, his expression unreadable. "What happens now?" Margot hesitated, the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had no easy answers for him, but she knew one thing for sure. "We face it all," she said, her voice firm. "We face it all, together. And we don't let anyone tear us apart." Ben's eyes flickered to hers, searching for something. Some sign of certainty. Some promise that this wouldn't fall apart like everything else. Margot could only offer him the truth. It would be a battle. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. Margot sat back in her chair, the click of the phone screen cutting through the quiet stillness of the study. She had been holding the photo for hours, but now, as she stared at the image, it felt like more than just a family portrait. It was the beginning of something new, or maybe it was the end of everything she had known. Ben and Nina. Standing together, side by side, their smiles effortless, their connection undeniable. The photo had been taken at a family dinner, just another evening where the world seemed normal, the secrets still tucked safely in the shadows. But now, the world had shifted. She had known it would cause a stir, but she hadn't expected it to feel like a storm barreling toward them. She didn't add any captions, nothing to explain the unspoken bond between them. She let the image speak for itself, knowing that the moment it hit social media, the world would demand answers. Her fingers hovered over the post button, and then, with a deep breath, she pressed it. It was a simple act, almost too quiet for the significance it carried. But the reaction was immediate. The first comment came in seconds. "Is this the new Ellery intern?" someone asked. Beneath that, a string of others followed. "He looks familiar. Who is this guy? Another Ellery cousin? Is this a hidden heir? Secrets coming to light?" Margot stared at the screen, her stomach twisting. The flood of speculation had already started. This wasn't just a picture of two people. It was the spark for a firestorm. It was the beginning of a story no one was ready for. Her phone buzzed again, this time a text from Dane. "What the hell are you doing?" it read. "You're destabilizing the family brand." Margot read the words, the bitterness in them burning through the screen. Dane, her son, had always been so concerned with the family's image, but now, with this simple photo, it was clear. He didn't care about the truth. He cared about what the world thought of the Ellery name. The ache in her chest grew. She had always known Dane would react this way, but to see it, to feel it in his words, it stung more than she had expected. With a deep, steadying breath, Margot replied, "I didn't realize blood was a brand." There was no immediate response from Dane, and she put the phone down. But the silence didn't last long. A few minutes later, another text came through, this time from Lisa. "Margot, this is dangerous," she wrote. "You've opened a can of worms and the media is already all over it. We need to shut this down now." Margot's fingers tightened around the phone. She had expected Lisa to react with fear. Lisa had always been about control, about maintaining the family's polished public image. But this was different. This wasn't just about keeping the family name clean. This was about the truth. A truth that had been buried for so long, and now it was breaking through. As she sat there, contemplating her next move, there was a knock at the door. It was Valerie, the housekeeper, a woman who had seen the rise and fall of the Ellery family but never said a word. Her eyes, though soft with age, held a quiet wisdom that seemed to see through everything. "I overheard something," Valerie said softly, stepping into the room. She didn't sit. She just stood there, her gaze fixed on Margot. Margot frowned, her pulse quickening. "What did you hear?" Valerie hesitated, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Dane. He was talking to himself, but I couldn't help but hear. He said, 'She's trying to replace me.'" The words hit Margot like a punch to the gut. Replace him. Dane had always been the heir, the one who would take over the legacy, the one who would carry the torch. But now, with Ben in the picture, things had shifted. The future, the legacy, everything Dane had worked so hard to control was suddenly in jeopardy. Margot leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning. The truth was breaking through piece by piece, and Dane was terrified. "He's afraid he's losing everything," she realized. The sound of her phone buzzing again snapped her back to the present. Another text. Another demand. It was Lisa again. "We have a PR person already drafting a cease and desist to send to the blog that's speculating about Ben. We need to control the narrative before it gets out of hand." Margot stood up abruptly, pacing the room as she read the message. She had known this was coming. Their frantic attempts to regain control, to force the truth back into the shadows. But the truth, as it always did, was pushing its way out. With one final glance at the phone, Margot made her decision. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let them bury the truth again. She walked to the window and looked out at the sprawling estate, the mansion that had been the symbol of the Ellery legacy for generations. The house had seen its share of secrets, but no matter how hard they tried to filter it, the truth would always find a way to rise. It would be a battle. But for the first time in years, Margot was ready to fight. The door creaked open behind her. Ben stood there, his face uncertain but his eyes filled with resolve. "I saw the post," he said quietly. "Are you ready for what's coming?" Margot didn't turn to face him, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I don't think we have a choice anymore. It's all coming out." And somewhere, deep in her gut, she knew. This wasn't just about a family secret. It was about the future of the Ellery name, and who would control it. The sun hung low over the mansion, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. Inside, the house felt unnervingly quiet. Margot sat at her desk, staring at the documents before her. The legal paperwork was clear, final. The amendment to the Ellery family trust had been drafted. It was done. Ben's name had been added as a contingent heir, entitled to 50% of the estate, to be split equally with Nina. The weight of that number felt surreal, like the balance of power in her family was being recalibrated before her eyes. A 50% split, in a family that had been built on the idea of legacy and bloodlines, was a statement that couldn't be ignored. Dane's cut? A mere 10%, and with a contest clause attached. The word contest lingered in the air as if the word itself could tear apart the foundation of everything they had built. Margot closed her eyes, resting her forehead in her hand. She hadn't wanted it to come to this. She had wanted to find a way to navigate the truth without it destroying everything. But Dane's obsession with power, with control, had forced her hand. The door to her study creaked open. A soft knock. Then the sound of footsteps. Nina entered, her eyes scanning the room before settling on the papers. She stepped forward, her eyes wide but full of determination. She'd seen the shift long before it had been formalized. The change that had come over her mother, over Ben, had been inevitable. Now the documents in front of her were the final confirmation. Without a word, Nina took a step forward, wrapping her arms around Margot in a tight hug. Margot stiffened at first, not expecting the warmth, but then relaxed into it. The weight of the moment was sinking in for them both. There was no going back. "You did the right thing, Mom," Nina whispered, her voice muffled against Margot's shoulder. "This is what needed to happen." Margot's eyes fluttered closed. The right thing. She wasn't so sure anymore. Was it the right thing for the family? For Dane? For herself? "Thank you," Margot replied, her voice a fragile thread. "I hope I did." As Nina pulled away, there was a spark of something else in her eyes, something more than gratitude. There was a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. Nina had always felt out of place in the family, too much of an outsider in a world that favored power over authenticity. But now, with Ben in the fold, everything had changed. The tides were shifting, and for the first time in years, Nina felt like she had a rightful place in this world. Just then, the door opened again, and Caleb stepped in. His presence calm but no less commanding. He had watched the Ellery family's unraveling for years, never fully participating, but always observing, always knowing. He'd been Margot's confidant, the keeper of secrets, the one person who had known the truth about Ben when no one else did. "I've seen the changes," Caleb said softly, settling into the chair across from her. "And I know you'll need help navigating all of this." Margot raised her eyes to him, meeting his steady gaze. She knew what he meant. The Ellery Empire had always been about control. Control over the narrative, control over the future. But Ben, with his quiet resolve, was changing that. And now, Caleb was offering something she hadn't dared ask for: guidance. "You're right," she said, her voice steady, though the weight of the decision was still pressing down on her chest. "He's going to need someone who understands the family business, someone who isn't afraid to fight for what's right." Caleb nodded slowly, his expression softening. "I can help him with that. He's already got the bloodline, but now he needs the knowledge. If you let me, Margot, I'll show him the ropes." Margot exhaled, a deep, tired sigh. This wasn't the future she had envisioned. She had hoped that Ben's arrival would ease some of the tension in the family, that it would be a way to restore balance. But now the balance was shattered. The fractures were deep, and the family would never be the same. Later that afternoon, the lawyer arrived at Dane's office, delivering the formal documents in person. Margot had expected his reaction, but it didn't make the moment any less difficult. Dane had been so focused on his position, on the control he had over the family legacy, that this was bound to hit him like a thunderclap. Dane didn't speak when he saw the papers. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. The lawyer, standing awkwardly, cleared his throat. "The changes have been made. The amendment is official." Dane's hands tightened around the papers, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck taut with anger. But he said nothing. There was nothing to say. His fate had already been decided. Later, Margot heard the faintest creak of footsteps on the floor above, the sound of Lisa walking through the house. Margot knew what that meant. Lisa's silence had been unnerving in the past days, too quiet, too distant. But tonight, things were different. The tension in the house had reached its breaking point. That night, Margot lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house, despite its grandeur, felt empty. The family had fractured. Dane's silence was like a heavy cloud hanging over everything. She could hear the muffled sounds of Lisa pacing in the guest room, the distance between them more palpable than ever. Margot knew that things were shifting, and she wasn't sure where it would all land. She had never wanted it to go this far, but now that it had, there was no turning back. When the truth breaks through, it doesn't just change what's known, it changes who we are. And Margot Ellery was finally ready to face whatever came next. But as the night deepened, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had done, everything they had all done, was leading them toward a reckoning they weren't yet prepared for. The headline hit Margot like a sharp slap. She was standing in the kitchen, sipping her coffee as the early morning light filtered through the windows when the phone buzzed. The newspaper's website had just updated, and there it was in black and white. Hidden Heir, Savannah's real Ellery legacy. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She had known it was coming. The media had already been circling, hungry for any shred of scandal or truth they could grab, but seeing it in print, seeing her family's legacy rewritten with such casual cruelty, was another matter entirely. Margot placed the mug down, her fingers trembling. Her eyes scanned the screen. The article detailing the shock revelation that had already spread like wildfire across Savannah. The headline, bold and accusatory, was just the start. The rest of the article was even more damning. Ben, the troubled youth, had apparently been taken in by the Ellery matriarch after a secretive upbringing in another city. The story leaned heavily into sensationalism, hinting at a hidden scandal that was threatening to tear apart the Ellery name. Ellery matriarch sponsors troubled youth, the subheading proclaimed. It was all so carefully crafted, so calculated. In the span of just a few hours, the truth had become a distortion of itself. This wasn't about family, or bloodlines, or legacy. This was a media circus. Ben's name was everywhere. Comments flooded in. Who is this guy? Does this mean the Ellerys have been lying to us all these years? Who else is hiding secrets? Is he really their son? Margot's stomach churned with the weight of the lies, of the way the world was twisting this into something it wasn't. She had expected it, knew it was inevitable. But seeing the sensationalized version of their truth on the screen, she realized just how little control they had left over their own narrative. As if the media's thirst for spectacle weren't enough, Margot had a decision to make. She had already anticipated the inevitable request from Lisa, and the call came moments later. Lisa's voice was tight with frustration, with panic. "I've just seen it. The story's everywhere. The damn press is all over it. You need to shut it down, now," Lisa demanded, her voice a mixture of anger and desperation. "This is going to ruin everything." "I know," Margot replied, her voice calm, though inside she was a storm. "But we can't control what the media does. I'll handle it." "You can't just sit back and let them tear us apart," Lisa insisted. "We'll sue. I'll have the lawyers send a cease and desist to the paper. This will get them to retract the story." Margot's fingers tightened around the phone. "Do you think a lawsuit will fix this? Do you really think it will stop the truth from getting out?" She didn't wait for Lisa to respond, her voice growing quieter but firmer. "The truth is already out there, and no lawsuit is going to change that." Before Lisa could protest, Margot ended the call. The lawyer had already advised her against the cease and desist. It would only fuel the fire. The public loved a good scandal, and in their eyes, this was exactly what the Ellery family had become: a scandal wrapped in wealth and old money. With a final breath, Margot stood and crossed the room, her gaze falling on the birth certificate and DNA results that had led them to this moment. She knew what she had to do next. She picked up the papers and called Maya Reyes, a local journalist she had known for years. Maya had always been fair with Margot, a rarity in the world of sensationalist media. She trusted her. "Maya, it's Margot Ellery," she said when the phone rang through. "I'm sending you the birth certificate and the DNA results. It's time to tell the full story." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a breath of understanding. "I'll handle it carefully, Margot," Maya said, her tone soft but professional. "This is big, but I'll make sure the truth is out there, the way it should be." Margot hung up and began scanning the documents. The truth was undeniable, and she had no choice but to let it unfold, no matter the consequences. As she sent the files off to Maya, she couldn't help but feel the sting of what was coming next. There was no turning back now. The next morning, the article hit the newsstands and the internet like a bomb. The comments section exploded with accusations and speculation. What's really going on with the Ellerys? If he's their son, how did they hide him for so long? Why is this coming out now? Ben had become the center of a media firestorm. Public sympathy swung toward him in droves. People saw him as the victim of a wealthy family's cold, calculated secrecy. In the court of public opinion, Ben was the underdog. He was the one the people rallied behind, the one they felt was finally getting his due. But the Ellerys? They were a family divided, torn between protecting their name and facing the truth. And as much as the public had turned on them, so had the family itself. Dane was furious. Margot could feel his anger even from a distance. He couldn't understand why his mother was letting this play out, why she was allowing their family's reputation to be dragged through the mud. And yet, every day, the truth became more and more undeniable. Lisa's voice echoed through the halls of Ellery House in the early morning hours as she plotted her next move. "We'll destroy this story. We'll shut down any rumors. No one can find out the truth. Not like this." But as the lies built up, the cracks in the Ellery foundation only deepened. Margot knew that Dane was spinning, trying to control the narrative even as it slipped through his fingers. As she walked through the empty halls, the weight of her decisions was heavy. And as she glanced over at the staircase leading upstairs, she knew that her son's silence was more than just anger. It was fear. Fear of losing control. Dad's spinning. Nina said quietly that evening as they sat in the living room, the sound of the media's noise filtering through the windows. She looked at Margot with a mix of sorrow and understanding. He can't stop lying. Margot didn't answer. She only stared at the storm outside. It was here now, and there was nothing left to do but weather it. The dinner table gleamed under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, each plate and silver fork carefully placed, a perfect illusion of normalcy. The familiar scent of rosemary and roast beef filled the air, mingling with the nervous energy that buzzed in the room. This was no ordinary Ellery family dinner. The silver and china that had been passed down for generations now felt like relics of an old story, a story that was about to be rewritten. Margot sat at the head of the table, her fingers resting lightly on the tablecloth. The room was set for a performance, the same old choreography, the same familiar faces. Lisa, sitting primly beside Dane, exchanged glances with him. Nina, her expression a blend of curiosity and defiance, was seated opposite her father, watching the unfolding drama. Valerie, always a silent observer, stood by the door, ready to serve with her quiet grin that spoke volumes. Margot knew this dinner would be different. She could feel the shift in the air, the unspoken tension that hung between them all like a thick fog. Dane had entered with his usual air of command, expecting his place at the head of the table, the position of power he had always held. But tonight, that was about to change. Dane's footsteps were heavy as he approached the head of the table. His eyes were already calculating, his fingers brushing against the back of his chair as if he owned it, as if it was his right. But Margot's gaze was steady, unflinching. She had made her decision, and now it was time to execute it. As Dane reached for his seat, Margot gently placed her hand on Ben's shoulder. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes. The power shift had begun. "You sit here," she said, her voice soft but resolute. The words hung in the air like a quiet command, a silent defiance to everything Dane had worked to build. Dane froze. His eyes locked on hers, disbelief flashing across his face. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. This was his seat, his place at the head of the table, the symbol of his position in the family. But Margot's touch, the warmth of her hand on Ben's shoulder, was a declaration he couldn't ignore. Ben, ever the outsider, seemed hesitant. He shifted in his seat, looking from Margot to Dane. His nervous energy filled the room, a stark contrast to Dane's icy resolve. Ben was still finding his place, still testing the waters of his new reality. Lisa scoffed from across the table, her voice a sharp, almost indignant whisper. "Margot, this is ridiculous." Her eyes darted between her husband and the scene unfolding before her. "You can't be serious." Nina, sitting just a few seats down, didn't speak, but a quiet smirk tugged at the corners of her lips. She watched, almost amused, as her father's power slipped through his fingers. It was a small thing, but Nina was beginning to see the cracks in the empire her father had so carefully constructed. This was her moment, too. Valerie, ever the silent observer, stepped forward, refilling Margot's glass. She glanced at Dane as she did, her eyes twinkling with something like mischief. The tension in the room was palpable, but Valerie's small, knowing smile seemed to say it all. There was no going back now. The clinking of silverware seemed deafening in the stillness. The air was thick with the weight of everything that had been unsaid, everything that had been hidden for so long. But Ben, as if summoned by the tension around him, finally stood. He cleared his throat nervously, the weight of the room pressing in on him. He wasn't the one who wanted to speak, but it seemed inevitable. He raised his glass, his hand slightly shaking. "To truth," he said, his voice steadying as he found his footing. "However long it takes to get here." The words, simple but powerful, hung in the air. The entire room was still for a moment. Then, almost reluctantly, The clinking of glasses began, the sound of polite applause rippling through the table. But it was a hollow gesture, a fragile acknowledgement of the truth that was beginning to break free. Dane didn't join in. His face was set in stone, his jaw clenched, the anger simmering just below the surface. The applause, the cheers, it all felt like mockery to him. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. The Illyri name, the legacy, had always been his to carry. And now, with one simple shift, it had been stolen from him. Without another word, Dane stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The room fell silent again as he turned on his heel, the force of his departure filling the room with tension. "I can't do this," he muttered, barely audible. And with that, he stormed out, leaving his family, his empire, behind. The door slammed shut behind him. The quiet that followed was suffocating. Even Lisa, who had always stood by her husband's side, was silent now. She glanced nervously at Margot, her lips tight, the wheels turning in her mind. Nina, however, was the first to break the silence. She turned to Margot, her voice low but filled with something unspoken. "You did the right thing." Margot only nodded, her eyes heavy with the weight of the moment. This was only the beginning. The battle for control of the Ellery legacy had just begun, and as much as the family had been divided tonight, the true reckoning was yet to come. The room was filled with a soft murmur, the quiet tension of a family poised on the edge of an irreversible shift. Margot sat at the oak desk, the thick legal document spread before her like an altar of decisions already made. She had done what needed to be done. The final clause of the Ellery family trust was now in place, a clause that could never be undone. Any party contesting this distribution forfeits all rights. It was as stark and unforgiving as the truth itself. Ben, still adjusting to the enormity of what was happening, stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the document with a mix of awe and uncertainty. This wasn't just about money or power. It was about his place in a family that had denied him for so long. Margot looked at him, her expression softening. He had earned this, had a right to it, and yet, there was something heartbreaking about how it had all unfolded. She pushed the papers across the desk toward him. "So no one can take this from you," she said, her voice steady, but the weight of the moment settling between them like a thick fog. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a reclamation. The Ellery name was no longer just Dane's to wield. It was Ben's too. Ben's hand hovered over the paper for a moment before he signed. The finality of it almost overwhelmed him, and yet there was a quiet relief in knowing that, for once, he had a place here, a rightful place. He glanced at Margot, his eyes filled with unspoken gratitude. "I won't let them take it," Ben murmured, almost to himself. Margot nodded, her lips pressing together. She believed him. But she also knew the battle was far from over. The legal side of things might be settled, but the family dynamics, the real power plays, were only just beginning. Nina, who had been silently watching the exchange, stepped forward. She had witnessed everything. The quiet strength Margot had shown, the way Ben had found his voice in a family that had long ignored him. She signed the document as a witness, her pen scratching across the paper with a finality that resonated deeply. "You're part of this now," Nina said simply as she handed the pen back. There was no judgment in her voice, only the quiet understanding that the Ellery legacy was being reshaped, and in the process, their family was being transformed as well. It was a quiet revolution, one that was unfolding right before their eyes. Outside the study, Margot could hear the faint murmur of voices. Lisa's voice, sharp and insistent, echoed in the hallway. "I want a meeting with the financial advisor now. This isn't happening. I won't allow it." Margot closed her eyes, the weight of Lisa's words pressing down on her. The old Ellery ways had always been about control, about maintaining an image. And Lisa was fighting for that control, fighting to hold on to the world she had built alongside Dane. But the more Margot resisted, the more desperate Lisa's efforts became. Lisa was quickly becoming a loose thread, unraveling at the seams. She wanted to challenge the legitimacy of Ben's inheritance, wanted to contest the trust, but the clause they couldn't touch, rendered it all meaningless. When the door to the study creaked open, it was not Lisa but Caleb who entered, his presence calm and measured, as it always had been. He moved past the paperwork with a single glance, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had been the silent observer all along, the one who had known about Ben long before anyone else. "I've taken the liberty of transferring some of the old Foundation's shares," Caleb said, his voice quiet but certain. "A new fund, Ben and Nina Endowment." "It's only right, Margot." Margot felt the weight of his words settle into her chest. The Ellery Foundation, built on years of old money and legacy, was now being redirected. The future, in the form of Ben and Nina, was being placed in the hands of those who had been denied. It was a symbolic move, but one that spoke volumes about where Caleb's loyalty lay. She didn't need to ask. Caleb already knew. The foundation was theirs, not just in name, but in power. She felt an unexpected sense of relief. For once, someone in this family was thinking beyond the surface, beyond the legacy that had always been about power. Caleb was thinking about what Ben and Nina could do with that power, how they could use it to rewrite the future. But as the weight of their decisions settled in, so did the awareness that Dane would not let go so easily. He was fighting back, whether by questioning the legitimacy of the trust, by rallying his supporters, or by using every last ounce of influence to regain what he had lost. The soft click of the door closing behind Caleb marked the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another. Margot looked at Ben, whose face was now filled with a quiet resolve. He was no longer the outsider. He was part of the family. But she knew, deep down, that the battle was far from over. Dane wouldn't go down without a fight. And neither would Lisa. The family would splinter, the truth would be tested, and only time would tell how far each of them was willing to go to preserve their place in the Ellery legacy. But for now, Margot was ready. Ready to see where this new path would lead them, and to face whatever consequences came with it. It was only the beginning, and the future had never felt more uncertain. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the only sound in the otherwise silent room. Margot sat back in her chair, her fingers gently curling around a glass of wine. But it wasn't the taste of the drink she was focused on. It was the letter. The letter that had been locked away for so long, kept from Ben for all these years. Ben sat across from her, holding the crumpled paper with trembling hands. The words written in this letter weren't just ink on paper. They were a piece of Ben's past, a key to understanding the man who had fathered him. He had hesitated to read it at first, but now, as Margot's eyes met his, both of them knowing the gravity of what was about to unfold, he unfolded the letter, his voice thick with emotion. I don't even know where to start." His voice was a whisper, a gentle tremor running through it as he read aloud, the words coming to life in the quiet room. "You may never know me, but I knew you were coming, and I hope someone makes room for you." The words hit Margot like a wave, crashing into her chest with a painful force. She had known Caleb, her late husband, had written this letter, had hoped for it to be read one day. But hearing it now, spoken by Ben, made the absence of Caleb all the more real. The room seemed to narrow around her, her heart aching with the knowledge of what had been lost, what had been hidden for too long. Ben's voice faltered, but he continued reading, the words carrying a rawness that reached deep into Margot's soul. "You will never know the weight of the choices I made. You may never understand why I left. But I wanted you to know, Ben, that I thought of you every day. And I hope, one day, you find a place where you belong. Ben stopped reading for a moment, his gaze lifting from the paper to meet Margot's eyes. His lips parted, but no words came out at first. The silence between them was thick, heavy with the weight of a truth neither of them had fully embraced until now. Margot blinked rapidly, trying to stave off the tears that threatened to spill. This was a side of Caleb she had never seen. The tenderness, the regret, the apology hidden beneath layers of pride and fear. She had loved Caleb, but she had never truly known the full scope of his pain, the secrets he carried. And now, Ben was the one who would carry the weight of those secrets. Ben folded the letter carefully, his hand still shaking, and laid it down on the table between them. He wasn't perfect, but he didn't forget me, he said, his voice low but filled with quiet determination. The weight of those words settled over Margot like a blanket, warm, yet too heavy to bear. Margot looked down at the letter, then back at Ben, the lump in her throat growing larger with every passing second. The family she had built, the lies they had lived, had all been in search of something. But now, standing here, at this table, everything felt different. They weren't bound by the past anymore. They were free to forge their own future. I never knew he thought of you like this, Margot whispered, her voice barely audible. I never realized just how much he carried, how much of it he kept from me. Ben's face softened. He didn't know how to fix it, I think. But he never forgot me. And in some strange way, that's enough. There was a long pause, the weight of the moment sinking into both of them. Ben had just discovered a part of his father's soul, a part that had been buried for so many years. But Margot, too, was discovering something she hadn't known. The fact that Caleb had known, even in his absence, that his son would need a place, a family to call his own. The door to the study creaked open slowly, and Caleb's quiet figure appeared in the doorway. He had been standing there for some time, listening without speaking. His presence in the room now was a soft exhale, the kind of pause that seemed to settle everything without needing to be said. Margot's gaze shifted to him briefly. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough. He had given Ben what he needed, even if it had taken years for him to understand it. Caleb had been the keeper of these truths all along, and now, in his own way, he was offering Ben the final piece of the puzzle. With a quiet nod, Caleb turned and walked out, the door closing softly behind him. Margot's breath caught in her throat as she realized that Caleb, in his own way, was letting go. The silence that followed was deep. Neither Margot nor Ben spoke, and yet, everything had already been said. The weight of the past, the secrets, the lies, were all coming undone. But there was something new between them, something that hadn't been there before. The acknowledgement of a truth that, no matter how hard it had been to unearth, was what they both needed to move forward. Nina stepped into the room, her quiet presence a contrast to the tension that had filled the air. She had been waiting outside, just as silent as the rest of them, but now, seeing the look on Margot's face, she stepped forward. You got remembered right, Nina said softly to Ben, her voice a quiet understanding. That's what matters. Ben looked at her, a small smile breaking through the seriousness of the moment. I think I finally believe that. Margot's eyes closed briefly, and for the first time in years, a tear slipped down her cheek. It wasn't sadness. It was release. The beginning of healing. The family was shifting, and though it was painful, though it was uncertain, it was also right. Finally, they were all in the same room, the same space. And for the first time in a long time, the future felt possible. The truth had come, raw and unvarnished. And now it was theirs to carry forward. The courtroom was silent. the tension so thick that it felt as if even the air itself had been frozen in place. Margot sat at the front, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had worn her best suit today, but it wasn't for the judge or the lawyers, it was for Ben. For the future that was now his. Ben sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his jaw set in quiet determination. He had never wanted this, never asked for the fight that was unfolding around him. But the truth was undeniable now. His place in the Ellery legacy was his by right, not just by blood, but by the law. His documents were airtight. The DNA results, the birth certificates, the photos of the birthmark that no one else had but Ellery men. Everything that had been dismissed as a family secret was now evidence, proof that he was a true heir. Dane, seated across from them with his lawyer by his side, looked more like a man who had already lost than one who was still fighting. His jaw was clenched so tightly that Margot could see the muscle in his neck twitching. There was no disguise for the fury simmering beneath the surface. He had fought every step of the way, every moment of this, but now the reality was too close to ignore. The lawyer representing Dane stood up and cleared his throat, moving with deliberate confidence as he approached the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth, "we acknowledge the evidence presented by the Ellery matriarch, but we must question the validity of one critical piece. Caleb Rourke, the late husband of Mrs. Ellery, was not present during the majority of Ben's upbringing, and therefore, any claim of paternity is, at best, circumstantial." Margot's stomach twisted at the mention of Caleb's name. She could feel the weight of the accusation in the air, the attempt to discredit the truth, to turn it into a technicality. But Ben's hand, resting on the table between them, tightened slightly. His gaze never wavered from the lawyer, and he spoke with a quiet intensity. "You can discredit whatever you want," Ben said softly, but the words cut through the air with a weight that silenced the room. "The truth doesn't change. I'm Caleb's son, and I'm Margot's grandson." The lawyer faltered for just a moment, but recovered quickly, his voice cold and dismissive. "I'm not questioning your word, Mr. Ellery, only the documentation." He nodded toward the papers on the table, trying to undermine what had already been established. "You cannot simply change history with a piece of paper and a few photographs." But before he could continue, the voice of the family's housekeeper, Valerie, rose from the back of the room. She had been seated quietly, her small, frail frame barely noticeable in the vast expanse of the courtroom. But now, as she stood, she commanded the room's attention. "I knew the day Ben was born," Valerie said, her voice steady but full of years of untold secrets. She looked directly at the judge, and then at Dane, her gaze unwavering. "I was told to keep quiet, to hide the truth for the sake of the family." The air in the room seemed to freeze, and Margot saw Dane's face turn ashen, his eyes narrowing. This was it, the final, unshakable truth. Valerie continued, her words carrying the weight of years of silence. "I kept my silence because that's what I was told to do, but I will not lie under oath. Ben is Caleb's son, and Caleb always knew it. He loved him, even from afar." The silence that followed Valerie's statement was suffocating. The judge, a stern but fair woman, looked at the housekeeper, then at the papers in front of her, before returning her gaze to Ben. The reality of it was now impossible to ignore. "I believe we can move forward," the judge said, her voice calm but firm. "The documentation provided is sufficient. The birthmark photographs, the DNA evidence, and the testimony of Ms. Monroe. This is more than enough to establish the paternity of Mr. Ellery." Dane's face, usually so composed, now betrayed the fury within. His jaw tightened even further, his lips pressed in a thin line. But there was no denying the judge's words. Ben was an heir, a rightful one. As the judge made the ruling official, Dane sat back in his chair, defeated, his hands folded tightly in front of him. The Ellery legacy, which he had fought so hard to preserve, was slipping away. His place in the family's future was now uncertain, but it was Lisa, his wife, who had the most dramatic reaction. She stood suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor, her face a mask of rage and disbelief. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice trembling with frustration. "You can't just give him everything. We'll fight this until the end." Without waiting for a response, Lisa stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. The sound of her departure reverberated through the room, a symbol of the fracturing Ellery Empire. Ben turned to look at Margot, his eyes filled with something between relief and disbelief. "It's done," he whispered, almost as if he couldn't believe it himself. Margot nodded slowly, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. She had fought for this, for him. And though there would be battles to come, there was no turning back now. They were on the other side of the storm, but Dane's silence spoke volumes. The future was in motion, and he was no longer at its helm. For the first time in a long time, it felt like the Ellery legacy was in the hands of those who had been left behind. The tables had turned, and they had only just begun to see the full weight of what was to come. And as Margot stood, she knew this was just the beginning. The family would never be the same. But maybe, just maybe, that was the way it was always meant to be. The grand ballroom glittered under a canopy of crystal chandeliers, their light casting an almost ethereal glow across the room. The scent of roses and jasmine lingered in the air, a fragrance that had once symbolized the grandeur of the Ellery family. Tonight, it felt different. The glitz, the glamour, everything had an edge to it, a sharpness that had never been there before. The banquet was black tie, as it had always been, but this was not a celebration of the family's success or legacy. Tonight was something else entirely. This was about a reckoning. The media buzzed with anticipation at the edges of the room, their cameras flashing as they circled the event like hungry vultures. They had been invited, of course. But this wasn't about honoring the Ellery name. It was about exposing the truth, as truth had a way of coming to light when it was least expected. Every guest received a copy of the letter, the one Ben had read aloud in the study, the one that had been hidden away for so long, locked in silence, never meant to be seen. But tonight, it was no longer a secret. The letter now sat in the hands of every important guest in that room, the scandal in black and white for all to read. Margot stood near the entrance, her eyes scanning the room as guests milled about. The room was full of old friends, family, and people who had once bowed before Dane's vision of the future. But tonight, Margot saw only the ghosts of the past, ghosts who had never seen the Ellery family as it was meant to be. The soft murmur of conversation quieted as Nina took the microphone, her poised figure standing tall at the head of the room. She was wearing a shimmering gown, her hair elegantly pinned back, the picture of calm resolve. Margot could feel the weight of the moment in Nina's movements. This wasn't just a speech. This was her declaration. "My cousin, Ben Ellery," Nina began, her voice carrying through the room with quiet authority, "and my future business partner." Ben stood from his seat at the front table, his tall figure drawing every eye in the room. The silence that followed his rise was heavy, expectant. The media cameras clicked relentlessly as he made his way to the stage. Ben had always been an outsider in this world, until now. Tonight, he was no longer a secret. He was a part of it, and everyone knew it. Dane had been invited, of course. The invitation had been delivered with as much formality as could be mustered, but the truth was undeniable. He had no place at the head of this table anymore. As Ben moved to the front, Margot watched her son, Dane, standing alone near the back of the room. His face was hard, his jaw clenched as he scanned the crowd, but he didn't move. His spot at the head of the table had been claimed, not by him, but by Ben. And the truth had a way of doing that. reminding people that no matter how much power they held, it could all slip away in an instant. Lisa refused to attend. She had made her position clear in the days leading up to the banquet, her eyes filled with a mixture of disdain and fear at what this night would represent. The Ellery family, as she had known it, was no longer hers to control. Margot had expected as much. Lisa's refusal to be present wasn't a loss. It was a statement, a final act of defiance against the family's new reality. Ben took the microphone, his hand steady as he adjusted it. The room was watching him, waiting. He cleared his throat, his eyes meeting those of the media, the guests, the people who had once stood in judgment of him. "This legacy," he began, his voice calm but filled with quiet conviction, "isn't what we take. It's what we fix." The words hit the room like a shockwave, reverberating against the walls, shaking the very foundations of the Ellery name. This was a new kind of legacy. This was a future that Ben would shape, one built not on secrets or old money, but on truth, and on healing the wounds that had festered for so long. There was a beat of silence. Then the room erupted into applause. Ben stood there, a small but genuine smile pulling at the corner of his lips, his eyes never leaving the crowd. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, as if time itself was acknowledging the shift in power, the passing of the torch. The applause, polite at first, gained strength, a mix of disbelief and admiration. Some guests clapped with enthusiasm, others with a sense of reluctant respect. Margot smiled softly, her heart swelling with a pride she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. This was Ben's moment. The Ellery legacy, which had once been his burden, was now his to claim. But she didn't join the applause. Her silence wasn't a statement of rebellion. It was the quiet acceptance of everything that had brought them here, everything they had overcome. She had no need to cheer. She had already made her peace. As the applause died down, Ben returned to his seat beside Margot. The energy in the room had shifted, but Dane's gaze remained locked on them, cold, silent. His jaw was still clenched, his body rigid. He had been defeated, but he wasn't finished. Margot could feel his anger simmering beneath the surface, a quiet storm waiting for its moment. And somewhere in the corner of the room, Lisa's absence hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. The night had begun as a celebration, but it was clear now that it was only the beginning of something much larger. The Ellery family had been fractured, reshaped by truths that could no longer be hidden. The future, uncertain and still raw, was now in their hands. Margot knew this was only the start. The fight for the Ellery legacy was far from over, and the real battle was only just beginning. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of Savannah as Margot stood in the front of the newly renovated Ellery house. The house, once a symbol of power, wealth, and control, now felt different, as though it had been reborn, its walls holding more than just the echoes of the past. The future was being built here, piece by piece, by the hands of those who had been overlooked, silenced, and forgotten. Ben and Nina had spent the past several months turning their vision into reality. The Ellery Mentorship Program, a project designed to help youth without families find direction, hope, and a place to belong. It wasn't about legacy anymore. It wasn't about wealth or status. It was about giving others the opportunities that had once been denied to Ben, the chance to build their own futures. The program was their way of rewriting the story of the Ellery family, and it felt good. It felt right. Today, they had just launched their first major event, an open house for mentors and prospective mentees, and Ben stood by the door, greeting the first wave of visitors. His face was filled with quiet pride, but the weight of everything that had brought him here still hung in the air, pulling at the corners of his smile. Nina, as always, was at his side, offering encouragement, her sharp gaze scanning the room, making sure everything ran smoothly. She had always been driven, but this new cause gave her purpose in a way the family business never had. The Ellery name, once something she had inherited without choice, was now something she was choosing to redefine. She had found her place in this new world, just like Ben had. Margot watched them, a quiet smile playing on her lips as she took in the sight of her children, her new family. It wasn't perfect, but it was healing. She had poured the family's resources into this cause, using a private grant to fund the mentorship program. The money, once used to maintain power and control, now worked to provide young people with the opportunity to change their lives. The change wasn't just in the programs they were building, it was in the way the Ellery legacy was being redefined. What had once been a symbol of status and isolation had become a beacon of hope, a place for second chances. As Margot moved through the room, offering encouragement to the mentors and guests, she couldn't ignore the emptiness that lingered at the edges of the evening. Valerie, the family's longtime housekeeper and keeper of secrets, had been a constant presence in the house, but today was different. Today, Valerie was retiring. Margot found her in the corner of the room, smiling gently as she looked over the gathering. It was bittersweet, a quiet moment of finality. "I'm going to miss this place," Valerie said, her voice filled with emotion as she gazed around the house that had been both her home and her responsibility for decades. "But I'm happy to see it change." Margot took Valerie's hands in hers, squeezing them softly. "You're not leaving empty-handed. The family trust has provided for you. I've arranged for a home of your own, a place you can finally call your own. You've earned it, Valerie." Tears shimmered in the older woman's eyes, and she smiled through them. "You didn't have to do that, Margot, but I'm grateful." She paused, then added, "You've done more than just save this house. You've saved all of us." Margot nodded, but before she could respond, the sound of an engine revving outside reached her ears. She turned and saw Lisa's car pull up to the curb, the door slamming shut with an angry force. It was impossible not to notice the tension that radiated from her as she made her way into the house, her face tight with anger. Lisa had filed for separation weeks ago, citing irreparable damage to their reputation. It wasn't a surprise. Margot had known the day would come when Lisa would choose her own path, one that would distance her from the family. She had spent too long clinging to the image of the perfect Ellery legacy. Now it seemed that image had shattered beyond repair. Lisa's eyes flicked across the room, taking in the reworked space, the new faces, the new world. The legacy she had once fought so fiercely to protect had slipped through her fingers, and she wasn't ready to accept that yet. "You've ruined everything," Lisa spat as she made her way toward Margot. "This house, this family, it was never supposed to be like this." Margot's gaze met hers, calm and unwavering. "No, Lisa. You were the one who tried to rewrite history. The truth was always here. It was always in front of you. But now, we're building something new." The words stung, but they were necessary. Lisa didn't need to understand. She would never understand. She had been so caught up in what the family could offer her that she had never seen what it could offer the world. Outside, the quiet hum of the evening settled over the estate, but Margot's mind kept drifting toward the past, to the choices that had led them here. The truth had been painful to uncover, but it had also been liberating. As she looked at the people in the room, Ben, Nina, Valerie, she knew they had finally begun to create something worth fighting for. Later that evening, as the event wound down and the guests left, Ben found himself standing alone in front of his mother's grave. He had visited her many times before, but tonight felt different, holding the letter that had once been hidden, the letter from his father, his real father. He felt the weight of everything that had led him here. The letter, the family, the legacy. It was all tied together now. And for the first time, he felt whole. "Thank you," Ben whispered, pressing the letter gently against the stone. "I'll make sure they remember us. The right way." He stood there for a moment, his face shadowed by the weight of what he had inherited. Not just the name, but the responsibility. But as he stood by his mother's grave, the stars above shining brightly, he felt a quiet peace settle in. The future was still unwritten, but this time, it was his to shape. And for the first time, it felt like a future worth fighting for. A year had passed, but the Ellery house felt quieter now. The vibrant energy that had once filled its halls had softened, the echoes of laughter and conversation replaced by an almost reverent silence. Margot, who had always been the heart of it all, was gone. Her passing had come peacefully in her sleep, the final act of a life lived under the weight of countless secrets and battles. For months, her health had been slowly declining, the toll of the years finally catching up with her. Ben had stayed by her side as much as possible, even as the family dynamics shifted around him. She had seen the changes, the growth. She had seen him take the reins of the legacy she had once fought so hard to protect. And now, it was his turn to carry it forward. The will was read publicly, as Margot had instructed. The room was filled with familiar faces, the remaining members of the Ellery family, and a few lingering figures from the outside who had become part of the new world she had created. Ben sat at the front, Nina beside him, both of them trying to keep the weight of the moment from overwhelming them. When the lawyer read the final clause, there was no surprise. Ben and Nina would inherit equally. Everything had changed. The family's assets, once tightly held by Dane, were now divided, his grip slipping from the legacy he had worked so hard to control. The room was silent, no one daring to speak as the lawyer finished. The air was thick with tension, but it was a tension that felt like the final exhale of a long-buried truth. The world they had all tried to protect, the secrets they had kept hidden, could no longer survive. And Margot, in her final moments, had seen that. Ben didn't look at Dane, who sat stiffly in the back, his face frozen in a grimace of defeat. Instead, his eyes turned to the framed photo hanging in the lobby of the Ellery Foundation. The one taken at the dinner table. The last family dinner before everything had unraveled. In the photo, Ben sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the people who had once been strangers to him. A family, yes, but also a reflection of the legacy that was no longer in Dane's hands. It felt fitting. The photo, the table, the place Ben had never asked for but had earned through every painful step of his journey. A legacy, not of privilege and power, but of resilience and truth. Outside, the sky was overcast as a soft drizzle began to fall, marking the passing of another milestone. Margot's memorial service had been small, only those closest to her in attendance. The quiet reverence that had settled over the day now seemed to hang in the air like a veil. Dane had been there, of course, but he hadn't stayed long. His presence had been cold, distant, and when the service had ended, he had disappeared as quietly as he had arrived. The Ellery legacy had fractured, and Dane was no longer part of its future. The world he had tried so hard to control had slipped through his fingers, the truth emerging with quiet inevitability. Lisa, too, had made her departure long ago, taking her exit as dramatically as her entrance. The legacy she had fought to preserve, her perfect image, was nothing but a shattered reflection in the rearview mirror. The truth had done what years of trying to uphold their family's reputation could never achieve. It had freed them all. A few days later, Margot's estate was settled, and the name Ellery House was officially changed. It became the Ellery House for Lost Sons, a fitting tribute to the boy who had once been cast aside, now at the center of a family reborn. It wasn't just about Ben. It was about all the lost sons who had been denied their place, all the families fractured by lies and power. This house, these walls, now held a different kind of promise. Dane, for his part, moved to Charleston. Quietly, almost without a trace, he left behind the world he had once dominated, taking with him only the remnants of a family that had been irrevocably changed. One email arrived months later, a cold, impersonal message from him to Ben. It read simply, "You ruined everything." The words were harsh, but Ben didn't reply. He didn't need to. The truth had already silenced him. The years had softened the edges of the bitterness, but it remained. Yet, for all Dane's anger, for all the destruction that had followed the family's unraveling, Ben felt no need to engage. The family, in all its brokenness, had moved on. And so had he. As the first anniversary of Margot's passing approached, Ben and Nina found themselves alone in the quiet of the Ellery house. It was a quiet night, the house echoing with memories. But there was no sorrow in the air, no lingering sadness. Instead, there was something new, something born of a life lived on their own terms. Together, they lit a candle on Margot's birthday, a simple act that symbolized more than just remembrance. It was a tribute to the woman who had seen them through the darkest of times, who had shaped them into who they had become. Ben stood there, holding the flickering flame between them, and for the first time in years, he felt at peace. The legacy, the name, the truth. They were all his now. Not just because of his bloodline, but because he had fought for it, because he had earned it. And as he looked at Nina, who stood beside him, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips, he knew they would continue to build this future together. Because at family dinner, when Ben looked around the table, he didn't just see the weight of their history. He saw the future, the legacy his son had tried to destroy. And now, it was theirs to shape.